Say you don't want to be a meta sheep. Where would your favorite rogue deck stand in this format? Could a deck like Blue Eyes keep up with the current meta? These are the questions a lot of players are now asking themselves as the major competitive event of the year has now winded down, and we can focus less on the hyper-competitive decks and a little more on some of our favorite rogue decks from history's past. So for this tier list, we are going to be looking at the best options if you don't want to play the absolute top tier meta sheep decks and show some creativity of your own. So I've broken up this tier list into 4 different sections. We'll go over anime decks, past powerhouses, TCG exclusive archetypes, and some other notable mentions and fan favorites. And throughout all of those decks, we'll rank them on the normal scale with S tier, A tier, B tier, and so on. And by the end of this video, you'll know which rogue deck to take to locals if you want to have a good time and still walk away with all that prizing. Before I begin, if you want to see more videos like this where I talk about some of the rogue decks of the meta and the power that they have, leave a like, subscribe, and also comment down below if there's any archetypes you want to see me evaluate next tier list, because obviously not everything can get talked about in just one sitting. So with that being said, let's get into the tier list. The first deck I want to talk about is the mighty Blue Eyes White Dragon. Fresh off some new support with Dragon Master Magia, some people have placed this as a new rogue deck that can compete somewhat in the Yu-Gi-Oh metagame. I am here, however, to dispel that notion. I unfortunately think Blue Eyes is still not yet where it needs to be to compete. I'd put this deck in the D tier rogue section. And I do this because the deck lacks a lot of power. It still has the same consistency issues that it had before, and with the new support, it really doesn't make up for anything too meaningful. Dragon Master Magia, while being a solid card, is just weaker than cards like Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, which all around has better spell support cards to flesh out the Dark Magician or Red Eyes theme. Magia requires setup, and a deck that already is kind of bricky and requires setup, while also not being that safe into removal, because it can be targeted and all such, ultimately means that against even other rogue decks, this often fails. Being able to pump out high-tech monsters fast with okay-ish effects is kind of nice, but it's nowhere near even close to the best deck. So although it may look dire for Blue Eyes in the moment, remember, do not fret, because we have announced now that soon, in the next few months, a Blue Eyes structure deck will be coming to the TCG. And the cards look promising. There's a chance that it could not even be a rogue deck, it would be a meta deck. So we'll stay tuned to see how the Blue Eyes cards can shape up in the future. Okay, so what about Dark Magician then? I just said Dark Magician has a better show of spell cards that can support the theme than Blue Eyes. I think the Dark Magician is better than Blue Eyes, but not much better. I'd put it down in the C tier rogue section. Truthfully, some of the best cards in the game are going to be spell cards. So the more powerful your spell cards are, the more powerful your archetype is likely going to be. And Dark Magician has quite a few powerful spells and traps that make it very strong. And when it comes to monsters, although many of the main monsters don't have too insane of effects besides maybe Magician Souls, there is one card that stands leagues above the rest, and even in modern standards, if you can summon it, is a very powerful card. And yet, that's none other than Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. It still outclasses Magia. I don't care how my duel with Sam went, Dark Dragoon is just a phenomenal card. Being able to pop cards, deal burn damage, be destruction, and be immune to so many types of interaction points means it's an absolute menace when it comes into play. And playing it requires a lot less commitment than the Magia. Using cards like Red Eyes Fusion, or you can use your Dark Magician Quick Play spell, or Magicalized Fusion. You can definitely sculpt your deck to make this card very effectively and efficiently, and back it with powerful spell cards like Dark Magical Circle with Eternal Soul and Magician's Navigation, which will give it that extra bit of oomph that Dragoon requires to get Dark Magician across the finish line. That being said, the deck is not without flaws. A lot of those cards I mentioned are old and have been power crept. Dragoon is really the only one that stands the test of time in terms of still being absolute top quality. Other decks do similar things, but better. That being said, hopefully new waves of support will change that, and Dark Magician can reclaim a higher spot in the future. And next up, we got Red Eyes. And unfortunately for our main cast of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters protagonists, Red Eyes falls alongside Blue Eyes in the D tier rogue section. While it also has access to Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, being a fusion of Red Eyes and Dark Magician, despite having one of the strongest monsters ever printed, the Red Eyes deck still clearly has worse spell and trap support than the Dark Magician deck. So while Dragoon can be a powerhouse in itself, and you still have cards like Black Metal Dragon and Red Eyes Fan of the Chain, which aren't completely terrible, your theme still lacks in a lot of ways. And it really feels like any Red Eyes deck, all it really is a deck that searches Red Eyes Fusion and plays it, because that is by far and away the best card in your deck to summon Dragoon, and really the only meaningful card your deck has at its disposal. Even older cards that were once deemed broken, like Red MD, Red Eyes Darkest Metal Dragon, no longer stand the test of time, being errated and now requiring you to summon a dragon that's actually meaningful not just a random body with attack points, to give you that power needed to hold its own in the metagame. So next up, we have heroes, and fret not every single deck we have from the anime is going to be a stinker. And if there's one that I think is the most well-positioned to keep up in the current metagame, it is heroes. A deck that I shit on a lot in my tier lists, but I only mention it because if there's a deck with fringe playability in the anime ensemble, it's going to be heroes. Heroes have a huge card base. They can play very many different strategies, and the best ones will incorporate a lot of them together, using the Vision Heroes, Masked Heroes, Destiny Heroes, Amata Heroes, whatever you want, you will use. And what that means is you get the best of several different archetypes. And the way that the modern hero deck works is they really do all flow together off of a single Vision Hero Ferris or Hero Lives. And the deck isn't without flaws, and that's why I don't put it at the top of the tier lists in the meta videos. But it is consistent, and its end fields are really impressive, actually. It's not something that is even a meta deck can necessarily beat. If you go first like Snake Eye, you can absolutely win the game. It's like not even something that's unlikely. It's your favorite if you go first still. That being said, going second isn't, the greatest thing for heroes. It's not the hardest problem because you do have space for some non-engine, but the engine itself isn't particularly the best equipped at dealing with playing second. Planes removal specifically tends to be a problem. While I find you can play into negation somewhat okay, when they start removing your bodies and you don't have yet access to malicious to replace those bodies, it can be kind of hard to get going. And their hero can only really fall in the A tier section. Still a fantastic pick if you're trying to rock up with heroes, but as far as rogue deck goes, there are going to be some better options, although as for anime decks, I think this is about where the best will see it ending. Now, next up, I'm going to take us all the way back to Duel Monsters once again. We got the Harpy deck, a deck that people have asked me a lot to make in Master Duel, and I promise I will make one in the near future. That being said, where's my analysis of the deck right now in the TCG? Well, unfortunately, it's going to fall right beside its dragon brethren, Blue Eyes and Red Eyes. Harpy's Pet Dragon is another inferior dragon to those, and truthfully, the theme has way less going for it than everything else. It has cards that are outdated, like Elegant Egotist is very old. Even something that was broken, like Hysteric Sign, is no longer nearly as insane as modern Yugioh cards. It's 10 years old at this point. I remember thinking that card was like one of the best cards ever printed when it came out, but now that's just like not even close to modern standards. So why isn't Harpy an F tier deck? Well, there is one saving grace. One of the best trap cards ever printed belongs in that theme, and in fact is even better in that theme than other decks. That is, you haven't guessed it, Harpy's effing Featherstorm. This card is ridiculous. So the fact that you're playing a deck that can search this, as well as turn it on a lot more easily, is the only sort of saving grace that Harpies have. And it's also a scary thing, because if Harpies do ever get support, this card will just be in every single game, nonstop. And holy hell, this is one of the most toxic cards ever printed. So if you're trying to let your opponents have fun, as well as you, I recommend not bringing Harpies to locals. Next up, we got our first F tier deck, and it's a deck that it saddens me to say because I quite enjoyed in Master Duel, and that is none other than the God card deck. Egyptian God cards seem really cool, and in my Master Duel video, it seemed like they can beat meta decks. However, the reality is there's a difference between TCG and Master Duel. The best of one landscape does change deck building a lot, as well as the balance with cards like Maxi being legal does alter a lot of decks' ability to compete in a metagame. God cards, for one, I think are an example. If your opponent knows you're playing against God cards, they'll know you have no real way of setting up negates. So they can play a lot more for survival and then OTK you because you'll be defenseless. While the God deck can have some very powerful combos like tributing your opponent's entire field or summoning the Immortal Phoenix, you really won't keep up in a sided format where after you surprise them game one, you can no longer catch them off guard as long as they're astute. But next up, we have another God tier monster that is surprisingly no longer an F tier deck and is shifted all the way up an A tier deck, and even I'd say pushing the boundaries of an S tier deck. And that is Exodia. Now, of course, this isn't used in the old context of Exodia being the FTK or stall deck. This is with the new Millennium cards, but I am intending it here for the usage of Millennium Ankh and your unstoppable Exodia fusion monster, because those cards are quite good. And because those cards give you free bodies, you can play a bunch of various Link themes in there. So yes, Fiendsmith, which I know you might not want to hear, but they go in pretty much anything that can summon two monsters. And then you also have access to a lot of non-engines. So if you don't want to go for a more combo route to use those monsters as Link material, you could instead fill it out with a bunch of stun cards. And you have Floodgates paired up with a massive boss monster, as well as a way to kill very efficiently. So the deck is actually not that bad. And that being said, it gets brand new support in Rage of the Abyss that's actually very good. I didn't really think this card was that crazy when I first read it. But now that your Millennium Blue Eyes can search Millennium Ankh, it means that if you already have Millennium Shield, but they ash it, you'll still have a way to access your Millennium Ankh. This also will give you an extra layer of specifically removal, which is going to be important to protect your powerful negate, Yugioh. I will be posting my own take on the more combo version of Yugioh in the next week, so make sure to stay tuned to the channel because very soon I'll be showing you off my very own Yugioh deck. And that brings us to one of my favorite decks of all time, and also an anime deck, my namesake's deck, and that is, if you haven't guessed it, Crystal Beast. I think it is due time that I release yet another Crystal Beast video on this channel because I love these cards and I think they deserve constant praise and attention. They're so flexible in the way you can play them as a combo deck, as a stun deck, as a Rainbow Dragon Turbo deck, that as soon as any new type of engine or even support comes out, there's new ways to try and be creative with it. So if you're looking to flex your creative muscles a little more, this deck is phenomenal. It has a lot of power behind it, but the biggest problem is going to be always the brickiness. A lot of cards in this deck are really bad to draw, and at least for me, that was always the hardest thing to overcome and why I went to 60 card decks often when I played Crystal Beast. Your spell cards are phenomenal, probably some of the best the game has ever seen. However, your monster cards are sorely lacking. They're the same as 2006, and they weren't good in 2006. So if they were bad, almost, oh my god, almost 20 years ago, they're surely not good now. So while this deck has an insane capacity to be better, there are things holding it back from being an absolute top tier threat. I have it in the B tier section because you can absolutely dominate locals and even a regional scene with this deck, but there are flaws holding it back from being at the top of the list. So let me know if you guys want to see me explore Crystal Beast more and more, because it's a deck that I will never stop loving and I plan to keep showcasing on this channel over and over again. Next, we're moving on to the 5Ds era. So truthfully, I don't know how many anime decks to pull out from the eras after GX because I didn't watch those shows. I don't actually know what's anime or not. I kind of just grabbed what I thought was an anime deck and was saying, I hope this works. And that brought me to the Synchron deck, a deck that has been somewhat popular in Master Duel, and I think for no reason the deck's terrible in Master Duel. So I placed it all the way in the F tier. And this falls in the kind of similar problem that a lot of other decks have had, and that is the weakness to side decking. If your opponent knows that you're playing, they're going to go first one of the games. They're also going to have two possible games when they can hand trap you, and especially post-side when they can side in a large number of hand traps. In a format where hand traps are already so important, making sure that your one pivotal card, Junk Speeder, the only good card in your deck pretty much, resolves is kind of hard. I think that this deck kind of just fails on the fact that it really relies on this one card to be good, and it just kind of is vulnerable in a format where it's specifically bad. There are going to be formats where this deck can rise up a little bit on the ranks, but I think until it gets support, it's going to be kind of rough. That's not to mention that with recent balance, we've seen Konami take the axing approach to a lot of powerful synchro monsters. I mean, obviously, the only one here that really applies is Baron DeFleur, but that is probably the best synchro monster in recent years. The fact that you can't access that anymore is a big hit. It is like going to make a difference for your deck. That being said, if you let a Junk Speeder resolve uncontested, there's still dumb things this deck can do. That's not going to change. You can definitely do some hand rips and some nonsense, but raw power level is not the biggest definer of a deck. So for me, this deck belongs in the F tier. The next deck I wanted to include is Galaxy Eyes, a deck that, if you hold on a little longer, will see the light of day, because we do know that OCG had a pack with support for the Galaxy Eyes theme. But right now, it is an F tier. This is a deck that I guess maybe I don't know the best, but every time I've played it on Master Duel, it just seemed so bad. You have powerful spell extenders, where you seem to summon a lot of bodies for free, and your monsters can search themselves as well pretty flexibly. However, the problem is, it ends up being rather weak to negation and removal because you have nothing good to force anything out. Your actual X-Deck monsters kind of suck. Your only good one, Dark Matter, is banned, so you kind of have Photon Lord as your best card, but that card alone is not going to carry a game state. It's not very aggressive, and as far as interrupt goes, it is just an okay interrupt. So that kind of leaves Galaxy Eyes in a space where, though you can summon a bunch of cool monsters very fast, you really don't do that much. But that being said, there's a lot of new support coming out, and we don't know what, but I assumedly Rage of the Abyss. They can give this deck a leg to stand on, and I'm excited for that because, like Blue Eyes, this deck is likely to rocket up the tier list very soon. Marching forward, we got Karibos, a deck that I made a Master Duel video on, and that is one of my favorite decks to play in Master Duel now because after playing it for those few games, it was so much fun. The link stuff you can do is broken, but in the TCG, all those link cards are banned. Anaconda's gone, Furious is gone, and now summoning 5 bodies as material is no longer as impressive. Like, what are you supposed to do with that? I guess you can do like Promethean Princess stuff, but Fire can do it way better. And if the answer is to go Fiendsmith, which is a reasonable option, you're needing 2 monsters for that now. And the thing is, like, that's very easy for any deck to do, not just Karibos, so you kind of lose your competitive edge. The difference between making Anaconda and Curious, as well as sending Snow from deck to grave, was that summoning 5 monsters was something that decks couldn't do. It was unique to Karibos. But now summoning 2 monsters is a strategy that Karibo is not special in, every deck can do it, it leaves Karibo rather like meaningless in terms of what it does. So unless we get a good way to use its bodies, it's a deck without boss monsters. And even though you can spam a bunch of BS onto the field, that BS isn't doing anything. So it unfortunately will reside in the F tier as well. And the last up, we got Yugioh's deck from the Pharaoh Duel, another brand new archetype Shining Sarcophagus deck. Deck that I've played on the channel a little bit now and on Sam's channel. It's a deck that I think is quite interesting, as well as getting brand new support in both the Battle of Legends, Terminal Revenge, and Infinite Forbidden. It is shaping up to be a solid rogue pick. Now, it's not the craziest deck in the world because it doesn't have broken one-card combos, it can't fit in an insane number of non-engine, as well as it can't apply the most amount of pressure off of a couple cards. It's going to require combinations of cards to really get things going, but it can't set up negates, it can clear fields, it can do 2-turn clocks relatively easily to kill your opponents, as well as it's consistent. And it can have some non-engine, maybe like 12-ish spots. So if you like playing this Yugioh deck, and I think it's a rather cool deck to play, I think it falls similar in the tier list to where Crystal Beast stand, in the B tier section. It definitely has plenty of merits to keep it going, but it lacks that kind of raw power needed to put it at the top of the tier list. So that brings it down to anime exclusive decks. Now again, if there are any anime exclusive decks I missed and you want me to cover, please let me know and we can do so in the future. Before I move on to the next section, if you're planning to go to locals with any of these decks and try out your dueling prowess, make sure you go to tsx1.com first and use the code POTATO10 for 10% off site-wide. Specifically, let's get those White Supreme Pros, my absolute favorite sleeves that I sleeve up every time I go to locals to film a video for you guys. So when you see me post this Millennium Exodia video later in the week, you know what I'm using. Okay, so let's talk about some of the past powerhouses in the TCG. You may have had these decks for a while and wondering where they stand now that they no longer are the top threat, either due to power creep or to ban lists. So I'll run through this rather quickly, but which of these decks are the most powerful? And first up is none other than Rescue Ace, one of the most dominant decks of the few months before Snake Eyes' final printing. And Rescue Ace hasn't really been hit on the ban list too much. The only real hit is Airlifter. The deck's consistency is still intact thanks to Snake Eyes cards still existing, and in fact only bolstered by Fiendsmith cards. Yay, every deck is better now. And the thing is, this deck still has all the crazy potential. Fire cards are still broken, and even if this deck is leagues below Snake Eyes, in my opinion, it's still very powerful. Pitting this versus any other non-fire deck, this will hold its own. It can be a bit brickier, and it can play less non-engine, making it clearly worse in every way than Snake Eye, in my opinion. It is still a fire deck, and in the year of fire, fire reigns supreme. This is going to be probably the best S tier deck we have on this list. Next up, let's rewind the clock all the way back to tier element formats. It's a deck that is extremely powerful, and so powerful it's been absolutely butchered on the ban list. With more hits than probably any other deck in history, this deck still manages to thrive because the power level of these cards is so strong. And the nature of them also means that almost anything can be splashed in them. And while yes, Fiendsmith can be used in pretty much anything here, this deck can utilize it even better than other decks. With cards like Pilgrim Reaper if Beatrice gets banned, or Beatrice itself, as well as being able to mill Light Fiends so you don't even need to draw or summon the Closed Moon to get access to your Fiendsmith cards. Tier is still just incredibly powerful, and if your opponent's not flooding you out of the game, you can push through most fields with just Engine, and if you go first uninterrupted, your field will rival that of almost any other deck, including Snake Eyes, or even better. So Tier Element is without a doubt an S tier rogue deck, and it's a lot of fun if you enjoy these type of milling combo strategies. That being said, I don't know how much fun your opponents will have, because I know a lot of people don't like this deck. Next on, we're going to go back forward a little bit to more around the Rescue Ace era, where the deck that I have played in this format is now residing. We got Unchained. Now, I think this deck is significantly worse with the Shavara hit to 1. The consistency hit is pretty brutal, and despite having some cool options as well as, again, Fiend support and Fiendsmiths like in the Yubel deck, it is strictly worse than Yubel, and is inconsistent when you play it in its own capacity. For me, it fits in the B tier rogue section. It's also just overall worse now with more extenders that Caesar feels like it's a lot easier to deal with than it was a couple months ago. While the decks may still have a problem with Caesar, and your grind game with all your floaters can still be quite powerful, so it's far from a bad deck, but it's also not nearly as powerful as some of the other options that I think are on this list. And to follow that, we got another deck that won during this period, Runix. And if you're a Josh Schmidt fan, you probably love this shit as well. And we just saw Josh get top cut with this at the European WCQ. And I don't want to frame this in the stun context. I think the deck is actually more of a meta threat, but White Forest Runic is the new synchro variant or combo variant to play Runix, and it seems to be doing just fine. You know, Josh proved that it has plenty of efficacy to it, so the merits are still there. And the Runic cards themselves are still very good, being able to cripple engines by banishing their cards. He has flow of resources as well as flexibility in terms of summoning monsters or interruptions or ways to push through fields. Until the Runic cards kind of get hit, I don't expect these to really fall off of this top tier rogue position, and in fact to be fluctuating between S tier rogue and actual meta. So right now, it's just S tier Rogue, but maybe we'll see it go back up in the future. Moving on, we got Sprite, the parallel to Tearlaments that got absolutely crushed with the release of the Yugioh cards. And while this deck did also get massively hit on the balance with the banning of Sprite Elf, it is a lot more alive than people think it is. And it's kind of thanks to the Ice Barrier cards, giving you new ways to access Totally Awesome. This deck is probably worse than I give credit for in the tier list video, but summoning Toad, as well as being good against hand traps and good with one-card combos, is something to be envious of. The deck is still very solid. Now, still can lack against removal pretty greatly, where if your opponent has a single Book of Moon, you may not be able to do anything, as well as its power levels could be kind of low. So I can see why this deck might not be an absolute S tier Rogue threat still. That being said, I think it does keep up nicely with decks like Hero and Exodia at the A tier Rogue section, where it's still a very good pick if you want to keep it a little more meta and recent in your deck choices, but also play something that is not crazy meta staple-ish. No Fiendsmith cards required, if you will. Alright, now let's go back further in time to around the COVID era, and let's talk about the Adventure Synchro decks that have been popular before. I've seen people still playing the Adventure package with Adventure Synchro type cards in some decks kind of recently, and it has me surprised. I think these cards are terrible. At least as power creep is gone, these cards are not phenomenal in terms of power level. They can be okay, they're not completely wasted, but they're not like screaming broken like they once were, but they're also just bricky. Having to play Fateful Adventure, Griffin, or Legal Knight, or both, plus Draco back, feels kind of terrible. I don't want to have to draw those cards constantly, so I can't imagine this deck being any good. And with the banning of the two of the best synchro negates in the game, it's no longer as easy to make sure your plays are safe into Nibiru. Unless, of course, you keep up Griffin and the token, but then you can't synchro with them, so it gets a lot harder. And this deck, I think, falls me in F tier, and very similar reasons to the Junk Synchron deck. Its vulnerability is just way too high. Bye-bye. Good riddance. Terrible format. And likewise, in the F tier section is another deck from that era, and that is Infernoble. Begone, foul demon. I hate Isold. Thank God it's banned. So while some people will scream that this deck can still play without Isold, I actually just can't see it. Isold is the glue that makes this deck playable. With that card banned, I think this deck just does straight up nothing. You have to open up several card combinations to make it any bit meaningful. It is weak to hand traps and weak to removal, so either like form of interruption you play into, it sucks. And that reminds me like of Synchrons, which is again the deck I think is just deserving to be on the F tier list. Like, how are you gonna win a match at 3 unless your opponent doesn't play hand traps and you get to go first twice? So without Isold, throw this deck in the shitter because that's where it belongs. Bye-bye. And lastly for this section, I want to talk about Dragon Link, another deck from around this period that is sustained a little bit more in terms of the metagame presence for quite a while. And pretty much until Magnet went to 1, we saw people playing it. The thing is, I don't think Mag to 1 was the biggest driver in its extinction. And there are other decks that started keeping up more and more, and Dragon Link stopped becoming insane. And now we got Fiend Link, which is kind of like the modern alternative to Dragon Link. But that being said, Bestials are still very powerful. And even though Baron and Savage are gone, which are powerful tools, Dispotter still exists, which is great for this deck. And Heretics Heal is still a phenomenal card, as well as other tools always come out to make Dragon Sport better. And Dragons are some of the most flexible and versatile typing in the entire game. So I think this deck is a lot better than people give it credit for. And if you're trying to play something that's more combo-based, more freestyling as well as something that's a bit older, go back to your roots a bit, then I think Dragon Link is still a fine choice. It's a deck that as well that there's so many options in how you build it that you can be more creative, and you can adapt it to the current format a lot more effectively. Like if you're playing versus a lot of decks that Bestials will be good against, Fiendsmith decks or Yubel decks, then hell yeah, throw in a heavy Bestial Dragon Link deck. And hey, if you banish their Yubel with a Bestial and then Dispotter, you can bring back their Yubel and make a good old Vardras. Attach that Dispotter and then revive with the Regained. How does that sound for your combo? So yeah, I think B tier is a safe spot for the Dragon Link deck. And that brings an end to the past powerhouses section. Next, let's talk about some of the TCG exclusives that have come out recently and where they stand in this list. And first up is Memagools. You know, I just posted a video about this deck, and that deck is really cool. I hope you guys enjoyed that video. If you haven't already watched it, make sure you go and watch it, because I too owe Sam's Yubel deck, I guess, spoiler alert, and I break a pretty nasty field in game too. The deck has a lot of cool synergies that, albeit are kind of toxic, as well as you can mix it somewhat of a combo mid-range deck with the Cashier and Fiendsmith cards. All that may not sound great that you have to mix all this crap together. It is kind of a deck like that. It doesn't have much of a winning condition on its own. You have to pair it with powerful engines to make it all worth it. And you make up for that by the fact that the deck doesn't really have restrictions like that, so it can afford to do so. If you want to play as more of a pure deck, you can play it in the approach of Labyrinth, and then just have like trap cards alongside it and really focus on Mimighoul Room being a broken trap card. But you know, I'd rather play Labyrinth at that point because it feels like a worse Labyrinth deck. With all that in mind, I place Mimigul solidly in the B tier section, where it can sit alongside decks like Crystal Beast and the Shining Sarcophagus deck, where they have lots of meaningful ways to play. They're consistent, it can fit in some non-engine, but it's not going to be the absolute powerhouses some of the other decks can be. Next up in our TCG exclusive list, we've got Plunder Patrol. And although this isn't the most recent TCG exclusive archetype, we did in a way get support for it. And this is what Konami said when they released Necro Equip Princess. Because when you equip your cards to your Plunder Patrol monsters, they are fiends, and you can now sack them off for Necro Equip. And while this is definitely a better support for Fiendsmith than it is for Plunder Patrol, and it's still helpful Plunder Patrol, essentially acting as a Link 1 to trigger some of your float abilities, while also being able to cycle draws and discard for effects now, like off Golden Hair. And those draws can be quite good. I mean, it's the whole reason you play like Bluebeard, right? So it's to cycle your draws for hand traps and back up your ships. This helps. The most played attributes in the meta right now are Fire, Light, and Dark, which are arguably the best 3 attributes for Plunder to target against. You can make your XC, which banishes monsters, your Synchro to banish spells or traps, or you can make your Fusion monster to negate monster effects. Either way, the Plunder Patrol should have a pretty good time dealing with the threats, as well as applying constant flow resources. If you're looking to strap on a straw hat and be Monkey D. Luffy, Plunder Patrol is a solid choice, arguably right alongside the other cards we just mentioned in the B tier. This may be sitting at the top of B tier though, because truthfully, this is a deck that I think can really exploit the local scene where people don't know as much what your cards do. And then moving on, we go back to a more recent theme. In fact, the most recent theme behind Mimigul's, the Ashen. Deck that I've explored quite a bit now on this channel, and you all seem to love it. It is a very cool deck, and I actually do think it is a pretty cool mid-range option. However, it does feel like it's playing the same slow sort of game style that decks like the Shining Sarcophagus deck and Mimigul, or even Plunder Patrol are trying to do, where they take a little time to set up, but are very good once set up, and also are consistent at setting up. That being said, it probably does all those things a bit worse than each of the decks I just mentioned. So even though Ashen does have a cohesive game plan and isn't as bad as maybe you would think when you read the cards, it does still stand probably a whole tier below the other ones I just mentioned. This cool, beautiful theme will likely lie in the C tier rogue section. Now rewind a little bit more, and we got another theme that is one of the biggest memes in the community, and that is Pistina. The deck that I've tried cooking up a little bit in Master Duel, and only with elements. The cards in that archetype are weird because there's some really powerful cards, then there's some really bad cards. Like I can't even believe they made them. And random cards that don't work together and lack of synergies. It just means a deck that doesn't mesh. This has been the mocking for a archetype for a reason. That being said, it's not like the worst thing in the world. I think it belongs in the F tier. It's bad, but like there's a little bit more comprehensive game plan than people give it credit for. That being said, it's still not good. You know, they get support with Vaudeo coming out. The rank 10 is incredibly powerful, but it's not enough for me to warrant this being any higher on the list. And moving up in the world, we got Beat Trooper, which has gotten new supports with Ragnar Rikas, giving you access to more link plays, some searchable traps to access disruption, and your end field overall is a lot better. It means you have better extension options as well when you go second play into field and when just off engine, or to power through hand traps. The deck is overall still in a better spot than it was before. That being said, maybe I hate on this deck too much. I have never seen the appeal to this deck, and it's always felt like a weaker deck than like everything else you can play. To me, this feels very much like a gimmick deck, and I may as well be playing a Weevil deck. It's not good. So I'm gonna put this on the D tier section alongside the Harpies, Red Eyes, and Blue Eyes. Like, you could just play those decks and probably be around the similar power level. So sorry, Herman, I know you love this deck, but I think this deck's poop. That's gonna bring a close to our TCG exclusives in recent years. And if you want me to mention more, then again, let me know. But there's one more TCG exclusive archetype from years back that I felt like was also worth a mention in our notable mention and fan favorite section, and that is none other than one of my favorite decks of all time and Farver's favorite deck, Burning Abyss. So if you want to relive the olden days, and you really felt you were good at Yu-Gi-Oh back then, you know, I felt I was probably like really good at Yu-Gi-Oh back then. It's when I played the most, I think. And you want to go play BA Shadolls. How do those decks hold up? Being able to mill 3 to accrue a large number of graveyard effects is still very solid, in the same way that Tear Elements and Lightsworns are viable picks. So VA still has it going for it. It also still has the ability to keep something from the hand very aggressively, so removal and negation, neither of which can turn to be too much of a problem, although Book of Moon effects can be kind of rough. This is the random downside where if you hand trap a Snake Eye opponent and they go Flamebridge, target your hand trap, Dogger Spell trap card zone, you can't summon a BA. That's also hella toxic. Like, those things will absolutely keep this deck from becoming this tier 1 threat. But I mean, that's not all. It's the cards are outdated. You haven't received support in several years, and I think that in general, the Burning Abyss archetype is just kind of outdated until we get new support that really makes it worthwhile. Now, because of its generic nature, you can splash Fiendsmith cards in there with broken graveyard effects, or you can play a trap card version and be rather flexible the way you build it. The deck is far from terrible. I think it has some merits going for it, really not that many though, but it still can be a deck you can disrupt locals with and pull out the dub. So I'm putting our Dante in the C tier section. And right up following it is Yugioh, which I'll also place in the C tier section. Now, the reason it's still going to be a comprehensible deck and not the D tier lower is Yugioh Winda is still broken, and you can fuse very easily still with a bunch of new fusion spells. You can splash in like the Invoked package, or you can keep it old classic. Now, the deck is still weak to the barrier. It is still very engine heavy, meaning you don't have much non-engine to counter your opponent's engine, and the engine itself is not the best at pushing through interrupts anymore, outside of Yugioh fusion specifically, which is not good if they have any sort of spell trap negate. I can't in good conscience put this deck any higher, though if you can put out a window pretty fast, the card is still very good. And next up, we got a fan favorite for another viewer base that's probably watching this, and that is Josh's viewer base, Paleozoic. Where do I fit Paleo into this? Now, in the TCG, we still have Toad available, as well as we've gotten a brand new card that seems like custom support for this deck, Magicaloidal Sol, I think it's called. And while these are cool support cards for the deck, it still doesn't fix the main problems that Paleo has, being a trap deck and kind of slow. If your opponent has back removal, post side is going to be kind of hard, as well as they can set up negates in the first turn uncontested, and you don't have a great way of dealing with it. So for all that, a trap deck really needs a lot going for it to really compete at the top level. Paleo isn't the worst deck in the world, and with rollback as well, I place it again with the other two options we just mentioned in the C tier rogue section. Now we're going to move up a bit to some other notable decks that have gotten support and I haven't mentioned yet. Gimmick Puppets, a deck that I think belongs in A tier. And I'm not going to talk about Gimmick Puppets too much because I feel like we've talked about it a bit before on other tier lists. The reason I don't think it's higher in S tier is I think it is a little more vulnerable to both removal and to hand traps than people give it credit for. While some turns can feel like there's nothing you can do against this deck, but also some turns where the deck feels like it just kind of collapses on itself. And that's not a good thing in a deck. So while this deck does have a lot going for it in terms of raw power, its ability to push through some stuff depending on the hand, as well as its FTK, I still think it lacks in comparison to the decks I put in the tier above it. So for now, Gimmick Puppets lie in the A tier. Next up, let's go to LEDE and talk about Lightsworns, another fan favorite and one of my favorites that, just like Element, it has a lot of flexibility to incorporate other themes alongside it. So you can be very creative with what you play in your Lightsworn deck. And same with Burning Abyss and Tier, being able to mill your deck is a very powerful ability that anytime you can kind of do effectively will put you somewhat high on the tier list because you can splash cards like Fiendsmiths in more effectively, or Element cards, or Bestial cards, or whatever give you an effect you have, like Blackout Laughs. I think Lightsworns are a bit underappreciated right now because of how powerful other combo decks are. But if cards like Appaloosa leave the metagame and other floodgates, also start being phased out, and we get onto simpler, more mid-range times, this deck might have a shot at being a top-tier deck. And I'll also be releasing a new Lightsworn video over the next few weeks where I talk about a new way that I've approached playing it, and I'm excited to try it out at locals. So let me know if you guys are looking forward to that, and we'll get some more Lightsworn content to you shortly. And then lastly, the final deck I want to talk about is Madolche's, a deck that really hasn't gotten enough love because it's got new support from Infinite Forbidden. These cards were announced, people got pretty excited, but I think people kind of just forgot about it when Fiendsmiths took over the show. But there's 3 new cards, and they're not bad. In fact, they're quite good. We got a brand new Exceed monster that is going to be at Shiramusu on your opponent's turn, so we have an effective way of disrupting the opponents with our Enfield now. But we also get access to a brand new Link 3 that is very powerful because on summon, it just adds anything to protect your hand. It also then special summons anything by shuffling back from the grave. So what you could do within those 2 effects is pretty much just special summon any Madolche from the deck, which I shouldn't have to tell you, summoning from the deck is pretty damn good. So I think that Madolche has a solid shot at being a good rogue deck, especially if you're looking to play something that has been played in the past, a bit more familiar to you, while also not being super familiar to others, and also better now than it ever has been. So yeah, A tier I think goes where Madolche lands. I think it may not hold up in the exact same power level of the other decks I mentioned in the S tier section, but can definitely hold its own and absolutely can walk away with that regional dub. And that is it. So here is the full tier list, guys. Get a good look while you can and let me know what you think. Now, obviously, there are a ton of other rogue decks that exist in the metagame, and if there are any fan favorites, TCG exclusives, or anime decks that I missed that you felt like deserved to be appraised and evaluated by me, then please let me know. And also, if you want to see these videos more in the future, where when we're in more of the down point in the metagame, when there's less competitive content to be made, then just let me know. I'm happy to provide that content to you if it's what you want to see. That being said, like, subscribe, leave a comment down below, and I'll see you all later. Peace.